would like to introduce Laura Burns, who will introduce our program and our speaker for today. Thank you.
Good morning. Yes, I think many of you already know Carol McCusker. She's the curator of photography at the Harn Museum. And last year, she gave us 2 talks for ILR on previous exhibits that were there. One was on Dreaming Alice, which is the one about Maggie Taylor through the Looking Glass. And the other was about Terry Evans, Stories of the American Prairies. And today she's going to talk about a new exhibit at the Harn. This is one called From Shadow to Substance. And this exhibit looks back at past history of Black America and also looks at current issues. And she was joined in curating this with 2 other people at UF. One is Kimberly Williams, who is a UF graduate student in English, and Dr. Portia Moore, which is a UF professor there. So anyway, Carol will tell us about it. And this exhibit will be on display until the end of February. So I think with that, I'll say, Carol, it's up to you now.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Laura. And good morning, everyone. I'm glad to be back at Oak Hammock. I wish we were in person. I was really looking forward to that. But like you, all of you, I'm really leery of the next couple of weeks. So I think it's good that we pulled back and we're back to Zoom, but hopefully not back to square one, that we can enjoy each other's company in the future. So thank you for allowing me to talk to you about Shadow to Substance. This is an exhibition that went up actually last July 27th, and it's going to be up until February 27th. So that's 7 months. And we're getting a lot of great positive response from the community and the UF campus. So even though it's probably maybe unlikely that you'll get to go into the gallery to experience it, but maybe in February, I really kind of recommend it because there's nothing like looking at the real thing, even though I'm going to walk you through the show. But there's words that are written by my co-curators that are really quite important. The name of the exhibition is Shadow to Substance. And I don't know if you know or recognize the woman in that photograph. So we have that projected very large on the wall. So it has a kind of light-filled ethereal quality. It's not an actual paper photograph on the wall. And I think that's important to what Shadow to Substance references and what Sojourner Truth wanted to reference here. Down at the bottom, you can see that these were photographs she had made of herself into what was called back then in the 1850s, a carte de visite. And that was essentially a calling card. So it was the size of a calling card. And she would sell them at her lectures because she was one of these huge political activists and feminists of the 1850s, and one of the most photographed women of the 19th century. At the time that this photograph was made, it was probably about 1858. She would continue to have these images made of her through the 1870s. She was the most photographed female and the most photographed person other than Abraham Lincoln. And she would travel through the north out to Ohio. She never came down to the south. And while she was lecturing, she would sell these and they would help her to move forward onto her next venue. And at the bottom, it says there, I sell the shadow to support the substance. And I always like to ask the students when they've come in this past fall, what does she mean by that? And it really takes a little bit of knowledge about the history of photography, is that when photographs started to come into full use in the world, but we're looking particularly here at the United States, that they used to call having your photograph made fixing your shadow. So fixing your shadow was actually a photograph. And a shadow then to come into substance was the whole point of Sojourner Truth's entire life. And I'm going to spend a little time here in the beginning of the exhibition just to kind of set up that dichotomy and what it means to push through the shadow to have your substance really seen for what it's worth. We have a reading list that I'm going to steer you towards at the end of this presentation that Kimberly Williams, our co-curator, created. And some of the books have had a profound effect on me. One of them is a book by Kevin Quashie. He's a Black scholar. And the title of his book is called The Sovereignty of Quiet. And what he really pushes for is that he wants people to come into the interiority of Black people and see them for what they really are, and that often takes a quiet and a chance to look at and delve into the interior life of others. And I think that's a good lesson for all of us, is to really see someone for who they really are. And so photography for Sojourner Truth, as well as for Abraham Lincoln, other contemporaries like Frederick Douglass, and we're going to look at him in a minute, that as abolitionists and the first civil rights leaders of the United States, this was absolutely essential for photography to show what a Black woman looked like, how she dressed, how she held herself. Sojourner Truth was very tall, very thin. Her friend, Frederick Douglass, he said of her that she was a charismatic public speaker who preached abolitionism and was a compound of wit and wisdom, of wild enthusiasm and flint-like common sense. I love that. So this was a woman who really knew what she wanted and what she needed to say, and she gained enormous popularity. And as I said, you know, she was photographed, one of the most photographed women of the 19th century. So reminding people that, you know, Black Lives Matter, we are, you know, come full circle into the 21st century with that. I mean, the shadow does matter once we give it substance. And we give this whole exhibition a large platform to really discuss this. When you walk in, that's what you're going to see on one wall. And then on the opposite, there's this, even though, you know, you can go into the exhibition and read our individual statements, but here's the three curators, and we each made a statement about why we made this exhibition. And here we are. So Dr. Portia Moore, she's the department head of the Museum Studies program. So it's been wonderful for her to use this exhibition as a platform for teaching with her students. She is a proponent of critical race scholarship and examining the function of race in museums and trying to change the predominantly white culture of museums and the elitist concept that a lot of people have about museums. We really want to change that climate. Kimberly Williams is a third-year doctoral student. She's been wonderful, a returning student. She's also very much into the healing practice of Black scholarship. She's the one who turned us on to Kevin Quashie's book about the sovereignty of silence, about meditation and taking care of yourself. And there's me. So it's the three of us working on this exhibit together. It took us about 2 years. I have to say it was the best curatorial experience of my life. I grew enormously, and I hope that that comes through in the exhibition. And as Portia and Kimberly will say, nothing about us without us. And so when I first initiated wanting to do this show about Black Lives Matter, they said, you know, hey, you need our voice. And I certainly did, because they introduced me to enormous concepts. I had a historical understanding of certain things, but certainly not when we move into the contemporary section of this exhibition. And I'm happy to say that we actually had some funds at the Harn where I was able to buy 16 new large color photographs by Black photographers for this exhibition, because we had a paucity of Black artists, period, in the Harn collection, but certainly fewer in the photography collection. So there were so many great things that have come out of this show. So the next slide. So then when you walk into the main gallery, this is what you see on that title wall, if some of you are familiar with the Rubin Gallery. And I'm just showing you this because this is the setup. And these two images we decided had the best opportunity to speak shadow to substance. So we're kind of setting the stage here, and I'm going to spend a minute or two, really looking at these two images. If we can go to the next slide, I'm going to bring them up bigger so we can look at them. There we go. So take a look at these two images. The one on the left is by the artist Doug Prince. And what he's done here is he's been able to appropriate a Library of Congress photograph that you see on the left of two Black women who initially, they look like they're enslaved. The image could even be from the 19th century, late 19th century. But actually, on the Library of Congress website, the title of this is Jail, Washington, D.C., 1919. Amazing, huh? We don't know why they've been brought into this room. That's a screen porch that they're on, and the screen door is behind them. The expression on both their faces is quite telling, I think. One woman, the closest to us, looks a little concerned and perhaps a little disconnected. The farther woman looks proud and actually inquisitive. Why is this photographer here? And that this is a glass plate negative from which this image was made. So likely the camera was on a tripod. And you can see their clothing, their shoes, the rug, the little particle of the rug there. Everything looks a lot shabby. And so, part of us were imagining, why were these women brought into this room? And, we were thinking, that maybe they had just newly arrived. And so they were going to be going through some serious orientation about what they had to do and not do. Maybe they were being sentenced. Maybe this was the moment in which they were going to find out. Or was there a sorority going on that worried the authorities for whatever reason? We don't know. But what photographs allow us to do is to give these women, first of all, their say or their presence or their due, to be able to imagine them. And the fact that their image now exists in the Library of Congress means that they existed, and they will move into perpetuity for that very reason. Now, we're going to turn to the photograph on the right by Ayanna V. Jackson. This is one of my favorite photographs, and also she is just a very powerful photographer and has a huge presence now in the art world. And we're so happy that we were able to purchase two of her photographs. And so what you see here are moments of sweet reprieve, is what she's titled it, from a series called Intimate Justice in the Stolen Moment. And I like to compare these two because, as you see in Doug Prince's photograph, that he superimposed a little fragment of an 18th century painting of a woman's white hands in a beautiful silk dress and lacy cuffs, holding a very delicate teacup. And even the content of that tea, the teacup and the making of the teacup and the tea, is all dependent on labor, servitude. There are invisible people who have made that dress possible, that have made that cup of tea possible. And that it is emblematic of these women, these Black women that we see in jail in 1919 in Washington, D.C., regardless of that woman who's from the 18th century, but that it is a statement about what Black women have always been profiled as, and actually with very little justice at all given to them and to their hard work. So Ayanna V. Jackson, one of the most wonderful things that she does in her photography is reimagine the lives of people in the 19th and early 20th century. So we see her, that's actually her sitting there, the Ayanna, with another model, and the little gold pillow that the woman's head rests on kind of mimics the gold square of Doug Prince's painting fragment. And yet, the connotation is that these women are resting, that they have luxury. Look at how their beautiful silk clothing and the beautiful couch that they sit on, that they have a history, that they have an interiority, and that they are, one of them is looking very calmly and directly at the camera, and the other one feels like she's dreaming of something or thinking about something else, and that these are sweet moments of reprieve from the kind of profiling that Black women have generally had. And so there's a book that Ayanna Jackson, of course, not only her own knowledge of the history of photography, but there's a Black writer, Saidiya Hartman, and she's also listed in our reading list. She has written a book called Wayward Lives and Beautiful Experiments. And it's all about going back into archives and looking at how Black people are portrayed and trying to reimagine the reality of those lives versus what we see in movies, what we see in literature, all of that. And to give these people a second chance, to give their shadow substance. So there we are, we're set up now for a walk through the show, and I'll try to move a little quicker. But I think it's important that we really, we can have the next slide, Julie, thank you. That we start with something that we've all been taught, the Underground Railroad with Harriet Tubman, right? We know about Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman there, you see over on the left-hand side, we have these photographs of them, and also Frederick Douglass. All of them very much celebrated and known in the 19th century. And as the first civil rights abolitionists and proclaimers and risk takers, they had huge lives, huge lives. What I'd love to find out, and what you see on that 19th century civil rights label, is I wanted to find out little bits of their biography that we generally don't know about. We know the large picture of their lives, but what I found out is that all of them were runaway slaves, which I did not know. They were all in their late 20s when they, except for Frederick Douglass. He did run from his enslaver at the age of 20. Harriet Tubman was 27 and Sojourner Truth was 29. And one of the little known things about Sojourner Truth is that she was the first Black woman who actually sued a New York slaveholder for illegally selling her 5-year-old son, because when he did that, just previously in 1827, New York had made the holding of slaves illegal. So he did this illegally. She brought him to court and she won. That's fantastic. A little bit unknown thing about Harriet Tubman is that new scholarship, especially with the Audubon Society, has shown that she was an exemplary and an enormous outdoors woman and a naturalist. And of course, you know, when she was leading the Underground Railroad of bringing people from the South up to the border of Canada, she had to know how to trap animals. She had to know the land and the waterways to throw off the tracking of dogs, to get them off the scent. She had to know the position of the stars to make sure that everybody was going in the right direction. She could understand bird calls for warning, and also knowing what plants were safe to eat, what plants were healing for wounds or for quieting babies. I mean, she was just one of the most famed and regional environmentalists, and having to know all about the environments from Louisiana through the Midwest, up through the New England area into Canada. And then during the Civil War, she was armed with not only a profound reading of nature, but she also carried a gun. I mean, she was a guerrilla soldier. She was also a nurse and a scout for the Union Army. And then Frederick Douglass, being Irish, I love this story, that, you know, the British made slaveholding illegal in 1833. So that was way before us. And a lot of Black Americans would go over to Great Britain for, I think, to only just feel that they were supported by another government, especially a powerful government like Great Britain, but also to raise funds for their work in the United States. And on the eve of the Great Hunger in Ireland, which is about 1845, 1846, that is when Frederick Douglass went to Ireland. And he was feted with wonderful praise and parties and receptions so he could speak and raise funds, to the point that the Anglo-Irish Protestants in Ireland got together enough money so that they could purchase his freedom with his slaveholder back in the United States. Because if he went back, he was going to be illegal and also be hunted. So they paid off his slaveholder so that when he returned, he was a free man. I think that's a little known and wonderful fact about his life. So we're going to go into the Underground Railroad. If we could go to the next slide. This is a group of photographs made by Janine Meekna Bales, and she made over 100 photographs by studying the Underground Railroad for almost 10 years. She did this. So this is a fantastic body of work. We were able to buy 4 of them, but as I said, there are 100 of them, and she's produced a beautiful book about the Underground Railroad. And so what we see here are The Decision to Leave is the title of the first one. Then we see the middle of this dark field with the stars gently moving. And can we have the next 2? And then there's one of the safe houses that you see on the left, lit up by moonlight. And then the Canada border with the sun rising. You can see a boat off in the water. And we kind of liked that arc of, decision to leave and then the arrival in Canada. So what's beautiful about these photographs, they're very large. We have them framed so that they have non-glare plexiglass, so you can see into the darkness, because the darkness is really essential to these photographs. It kind of necessitates a knowledge of what it felt like to be on the run, that these people were always listening to the stillness, that there had to be this kind of enormous vulnerability to do this extreme leave taking in the dark, carrying virtually nothing, through these obscure paths of finding the safe houses, which some of them were owned by Native Americans, and going through swamps and hard lands and all kinds of weather, and desperately trying to not be detected. And that blackness, actually, the blackness of their skin, the blackness of night, was this wonderful blanket, that it was actually the daylight that became the dangerous time. Because as we know, there were vigilantes that were hunting to return slaves for a profit. And so, these are moments of extreme, they're also moments of incredible courage. And we just wanted to state that from the outset. So the next photographs. We also went to Smathers Library. Some of you probably know they have a great photography collection at UF's Smathers Library. And we went there a few times, Kimberly, Portia, and myself. And we wanted to get as many photographs of Jim Crow South. And these photographs are all from North Florida. Not so much the ones of the Great Migration here, but you're going to see some others too. But the ones on the left about Jim Crow, that's here in Gainesville. And also just a little outside of town in the turpentine camps that a lot of Black men were sort of conscripted laborers that were forced into this kind of harsh condition. And the Jim Crow South, you probably know, it was an anti-Black caste system where from the 1870s, even though despite emancipation, everything closed down for so many Blacks, for most Blacks. And some people feel that, there's a second Jim Crow now in the 21st century, which is all about incarceration and the illegal arrest of Black people without trial. So, whatever they could find the Black people making any kind of offense, the slightest bit, they would be incarcerated. If they stepped out of line, if they looked a certain way or said something, there was persecution guaranteed. And so these photographs you see are from North Florida. And what I love about them is the beauty of the way the women are dressed. I think we have a close-up of this, if we could look at the next slide. Yeah, here we go. And also of the home service agents, this is all about people making sure that, it was kind of like an agency that made sure that everybody had the proper way to can food, to slaughter, animals, how to raise crops and take care of their homes, how to purchase a home if that was ever available to them, or to make their lives better, to acquire education. And then you see these young girls on the lower left there from Gainesville's Lincoln High School early on. This is probably in the 1920s, in their white uniforms, the turpentine industry you see over on the right, and also just a beautiful sense of style with these women in the center. So despite these conditions of Jim Crow, they were taking care of themselves. There was great pride and as much progress as they could make under the circumstances. And these are the Great Migration. I had heard about the migration. Maybe your parents and grandparents would tell you stories about the Great Migration. But, it was from roughly the First World War, which you see soldiers up there on the upper left that are World War I soldiers returning to the United States, and they all have on their lapels the French Croix de Guerre medal. And that was for bravery. They were incredible soldiers that did some of the hardest work during the First World War. And upon returning, thinking that they would have won a measure of respect and liberation back in the United States. But 1919 was actually called the Red Summer because of how many of these men were beaten or killed if they dared to wear their uniform on the streets. And so these 9 men that you see here, that's a photograph from the Library of Congress as well, which has some of the best records of our country's history. And one of the curators at the Library of Congress went into each one of their lives, found out their names, what happened to them after this photograph. All of them survived. They did not experience a terrible violence. But, the limitations, of course, of what they could do with their lives. And yet look at how proud and how beautifully they served the country. A family arriving in Chicago. The folks that you see with their car, there's a Florida license plate on that car, and it's got a tag for 1940. So they're leaving Florida, going up north. And then I think that the one at the bar must be in Los Angeles, because when you look carefully at the murals on the background, they're all Walt Disney murals. I find that kind of interesting. So what I didn't know about the Great Migration, I knew about it very superficially, but one of the major components was not only Jim Crow and the Great Depression, but in the mid-1920s, the agrarian devastation of the boll weevil from Texas to Florida. It was complete devastation of all of the cotton fields. And it had a domino effect so that sharecropping and land owning was near to impossible. And so the Chicago Defender, which was a Black-owned newspaper, was beckoning, the Blacks from the South to come up to urban factory jobs and that their life would actually be better. Now, we know that it's not entirely true. There are pros and cons about going up north or going out west. They were still Black, and we have a terrible oppression of Black culture and people. But migration also meant that they were beyond the grasp of Jim Crow, that they could travel more freely, even though there were still those sundowner towns, where if you were traveling, you better get into a hotel before sundown. And there were Black hotels only, of course, when you were traveling. But then they could also start to enter into politics, into influence politics with their voting, and they could enroll in schools, open public schools. And then that's also when the NAACP began. So the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People started to really make a scene on all the large urban cities throughout the North and West. And so, they brought their families, their energy, their culture up to the rest and disseminated it through the rest of the country, which is why, the whole notion of how jazz started. And how their music and their art forms, their dancing, whatever we now prize, what came out of that is the opportunity for them to influence the direction of our cultural institutions. So could we have the next? And this was Kimberly Williams' favorite section. She did this herself, of choosing images of childhood, Black childhood. And you can see up there at the top, there's the Lincoln High School homecoming of 1947 of the majorettes. The energy of those kids, and a child, a baby being born over way in the far left. That's a famous photograph by W. Eugene Smith, who's one of our great 20th century photographers. He did a life photo essay on this Black nurse who went around in the South and helped to nurse people who were dying, help people deliver babies, an integral part of the network of self-help among Black families. But as Kimberly writes in her childhood text panel, is that you can see with the images in the center there of that young Black girl with her hands on her hips, and also then below that, the three young boys from, probably the 60s, I think that image, or early 70s, where they have their afros, that there's a toughness that Kimberly writes about, of how harsh Black children were treated in school, and also profiled and incriminated against by teachers and the system. So powerful commentary, even though these children look so beautiful and joyous. Can we have the next? And this was a section that Professor Moore, Portia Moore, curated on Black masculinity, of images of men, the one in the upper left there, a gorgeous platinum print, where the man wears this beautiful white hoodie, and how, even though that image was made back in the 80s, I think it was, that the hoodie has come to represent something nefarious and dark because of Trayvon Martin's murder. But that, there's again, the interiority of these men and their lives and their kindness. And as Portia says, that the profile of men, Black men, to be corrupt and thugs and evil and dangerous is the pushback that she's looking for in this grouping. And we were able to purchase the image in the center bottom of the man with his coat around his little daughter. And then also the Benji Reed photograph called A Work of Heart, which is a British photographer and a British Black man who is a famous rapper in Great Britain. And he died of COVID in 2020, May of 2020. And this was the cover of his last CD. His music has had a huge influence on British rap. But we just loved this image, and it's actually the only print that exists of it that the photographer and the family of the rapper, his name is Ty, that they allowed us to have this print made, and it's quite large and just a beautiful statement about the heart, of opening up one's heart. So we feel fortunate to have that one. The civil rights movement, we've had these photographs in our collection for a few years. We have James Baldwin there in the lower right. And then, of course, the march in Montgomery to Selma of Martin Luther King, and the group about to start its march. And there's George Foreman, not George Foreman, James Foreman, Dr. Abernathy, John Lewis. And then over on the far left is a picture of a woman, Mother Brown, who in the time of this image, she was 110 years old. And the Statue of Liberty is over her shoulder up there in the fog off in the distance. And Bruce Davidson photographed her on a ferry going to Staten Island, and took this image of her and interviewed her about what she had lived through. She lived to be 116 years old. And then I love the top right, where these policemen are arresting this young Black woman, and the marquee to the movie theater, the movie that's playing, is Damn the Defiant, which I think is appropriate. We don't know who we're damning here and who's being defiant, but I love the bow ties of the cops, of how different. We're going to see another image of an arrest of a woman, and how differently the police are dressed here in the 1960s compared to the 21st century. So could we have the next? You may not know that the great author and anthropologist Zora Neale Hurston has a significant archive at the University of Florida's Smathers Library. And so Portia Moore loves Zora Neale Hurston. One of her most famous books is Their Eyes Were Watching God, which is a fictional account of growing up in the South. But here are two pictures of Zora Neale Hurston. She was part of the Federal Writers Project during the 30s, and part of having grown up actually in Florida, and she died in Florida. But during the heyday of her years as a scholar, an anthropologist, a writer, she recorded songs all through the South and in different parts of the world as well. She went over to Africa. That she was able to record a lot of historical significance of two Black lives. And she was part of the Harlem Renaissance in the 1930s. And the next. So one of the movements that when I take kids, I call them kids, the college kids through this show, they love this section called The Farms of North Florida and Soul Fire Farm. Now, again, on the left, what you're seeing is Florida circa 1910, 1920. These are gorgeous photographs. They're in pristine condition, and just showing, the raising of cattle, the crops, the industriousness, the self-sufficiency. This is about agriculture as an economy. And, Black farmers were, during this whole period, and certainly after the Civil War, were indentured as sharecroppers. The fruits of their labor were demanded by white landowners. They were rented part of their land, but very often they were denied or even robbed of the land that right after the Civil War they were granted. So that whole thing of ownership of your own land, and also the inequality, that stole the generational wealth that they could then hand on that property from parent to child, that kind of generational wealth, all of that was taken away. But what you see now in the 21st century is what we see on the right with these large color photographs of Soul Fire Farm in particular, but there are many such farms, but this one is the most successful. It's an all Black farm up in upstate New York. And it's like a thriving community center that its intention is to uproot racism and ceding the sovereignty of Black labor, and particularly the food system of which they all survive on. So it reaches over 10,000 people annually, and they teach activist farming, food security, health, environmental justice, reparations, and land return initiatives. And they have several books, and one of them is called Farming While Black. And it's a cooperative, this whole farm system, so that the legacy will continue. They really want this to be generational, and a new opening of, what I think probably in the 60s, the 1960s, African Americans didn't want to become like their grandparents, as you see in these photographs on the left. They didn't want to do farming. And, it smacked too much of that oppression, but that's all turned around now with this younger generation, where farming is where it's at. And there's a huge movement. And even within prisons now, they are having prisoners go out and cultivate areas of, even there's a huge one down in Orlando, of prisoners learning how to farm, creating farms and sustainability, so that they have something for when they are released. One of the stories that Soulfire Farm loves to tell is that the legacy of the ancestral grandmothers, the mothers that came over, in the 1600s, when the first slaves were brought over from Africa, was that they braided the seeds of their cultivation in Africa. They braided seeds into their hair before boarding the transatlantic slave ships. And then that just showed this hopeful belief that when they reached the other shore, that they would be able to harvest their own crops, which some of them did. But these stories are important to this generation, and they also give me great hope as well. Could we have the next? So now we're moving into, and I'll try to pick up the pace if we're getting behind on time. This is a photograph that recreates Trayvon Martin and the moment of his death. Those are Skittles that you see scattered all around him, and also Arizona iced tea cans, which is what he had just purchased with his white hoodie on before he was murdered by George Zimmerman. And this is a kind of beautiful homage to this young boy. And he's sort of cradled in this, it's like a corona that you see on the Lady of Guadalupe, that kind of exultant halo around his body. And just leaving us to imagine an alternative life for him, which is what Kimberly Williams did in her text panel, is to write an alternative to that day for Trayvon Martin. Beautiful image. The photographer, Omar Victor Diop, is French Senegalese, and he's done a whole series looking at America's treatment of African Blacks. And he did a whole series on what he called liberty, and this is one of them from that series. He also did images of, it just went out of my mind. I'll remember it, but let's go on to the next image. So these are very clearly straight documentary. These are photojournalists, both of them dedicated to the Black Lives Matter protests. Michael McCoy went to the COVID protests in front of the White House, which is what you see here, with these two Black ministers blessing these make-believe body bags, taking their toll on, essential workers, a lot of them people of color. And then some of you may know the image of the bottom left. Aisha Evans is the woman's name who surrenders herself. And, we can compare that back to Damn the Defiant, the image where the woman was being taken away by the cops who had little bow ties on. And to see, the SWAT teams of how people, policemen are dressed, and contrasted to the delicacy of her surrender. That went viral in 2016 when that photograph was made. Everybody around the world saw this. And it was compared to the image in Tiananmen Square in 1989 of the man standing up against the tanks, the tank man who resisted the tanks in China. So with that kind of power, you know, the same protests is what you see above that image of the man on the ground, which brings, you know, images of George Floyd and others. This is one of the most uplifting is Tricia Hershey, who has collaborated with the photographer Charlotte Watts. And that is Tricia Hershey in the photograph in the yellow gown on the left, and then the one in the white blouse on the right. And she has started a ministry called the Nap Ministry. And that is indeed what she proposes is that, as with Kimberly Williams, what we have to take care of ourselves during this moment of extreme change. And part of it is to rest, to feel you have the right to rest. The symbolism on the photograph on the left is the superimposition of the cotton fields that you see below her feet as she rests on this bed, and also enclosed on 3 sides in a factory system. But that rest is essential because a lot of the civil rights movement workers of the 1960s died from stress, heart disease, diabetes, and not knowing how to both be activists and also caretakers of themselves primarily and of others. So she actually proposes napping, and we were going to, she does this in museums where people come in with yoga mats and pillows and, you know, take a moment to rest and meditate together. And we desperately wanted to have her come, but because of COVID, and also she is writing a book and she said she had a serious deadline, it's just not possible. So maybe another time. The next one. This is the other Ayanna V. Jackson, and this is called Sighting in the Abyss. And this is about, you know, the transatlantic slave trade coming across the ocean. And that's what you see in the white netting is the foam of the waves of the Atlantic. And you can see that her arms and her waist are bound by chains, and that she still stands strong. You know, there's this netting over her that looks like a mourning shroud. She has shells around her neck that almost give her that Elizabethan Victorian look of the collar from that period. But that she signifies the many people who drowned during the crossing, the transatlantic passage. And there's a belief in this Afrofuturism of creating alternative myths that there is a number of those people who drowned that still live under the Atlantic, and that they are the ancestors who nurture the current generation living on land. And so that there's this profound give and take between them of how to survive and how to progress beyond this notion of enslavement. So these are 2 different photographers, Endia Beale on the left and Sheila Pre-Bright. And Endia Beale, her portrait here of Dr. William Barber won one of the top awards for Time magazine as one of the best photographs of 2020. Some of you may remember Dr. Barber gave the talk during President Biden's inauguration. He gave the homily. He's a very beautiful, powerful speaker. There's YouTube connections that you can see him speak. He's full of love and generosity. He lives in North Carolina. He has a regular meeting of people called Moral Mondays, in which they meet Monday at the Capitol in North Carolina to listen to all the laws or different things that are being enacted. And what you see with Endia Beale's photograph of him is first his church, which you see the stained glass windows and the pews on the right and left, but she's dropped a curtain behind him, and you see the curtain there on the pole and the chandeliers hanging down in the red carpet, and that's the state capitol. the building where all the laws are transacted. So she's conflated the image of the Capitol with the church, and that is the source of Dr. Barber's power, is that he's making sure that everybody is represented fairly, not just Black people, but people of color, queer people, everyone gets represented fairly. And he's been very successful. And so that said, there are invisible empires such as religion, and also you see the great relief there that's outside of Atlanta Stone Mountain, which is a carved relief of Jackson and Sherman and Jackson and Jefferson, President Jefferson Davis, and then also Robert E. Lee. And that these things are always with us, and how do we negotiate them? And the next, I'm going to finish up here with the last one. Erika Hart, who is a young Black woman who is a breast cancer survivor and a professor, a scholar, an activist, one of the most photographed women of 2020 and 2021, who's very proud and strong and vocal. And this is a great image of her. And then also another Sheila P. Bright that has become our signature of this exhibition. There's a huge vinyl of that on the outside of the Harn, of the rebirth of us, with this beautiful, peaceful image of this Black woman surrounded by sunflowers. So can we have the next one? So there it is. There's the Sheila P. Bright on at the front of the Harn. And I just want to call your attention to the aftercare reading and the resource list. You can go to the Harn website and get a copy of that and take a look at it. We also have it in hard form, that you can take a copy away with you when you go to the gallery. And it's all kinds of great information that it was primarily Kimberly Williams who put it together, of a reading list, films to watch, walks to take, historical places to go to in North Florida, and it's just a great resource. So I hope you can make it to Shadow to Substance sometime, probably next month, can we hope? And I would love to take any one of you through it, but it's a very, very beautiful exhibition, if I don't mind saying so myself. And I'm willing to take any questions or comments that you have.
Carol, thank you. You're so articulate, and I feel like I've had a wonderful introduction, but there's so much more to learn about the exhibit. Thank you to all three of you for doing this.
I'll extend your thanks. I know Kimberly and Portia will love hearing it.
Thank you. Faith, go ahead.
Could you go back to the first slide with Sojourner Truth?
Uh-huh.
I wanted to say something I learned from a historian about that.
Okay, great.
You can see the yarn going down her skirt. It's arranged to show the east coast of this country.
Oh my goodness.
She wanted to emphasize that she was an itinerant preacher and that she traveled around.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that is such a great notice.
It's not that way in all of the photos of her, but this one's very interesting.
Well,
and
go ahead.
I also wanted to comment on Dr. Barber, the preacher shown in his church and also the legislator, that he has revived Martin Luther King's Poor People's Campaign.
Yes.
That emphasized the influence of capitalism and militarism and on racism. And racism is a threefold problem in this country.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Portia Moore talks about capitalism in some of the wall texts. And, my introduction here was a gloss over, but, all of those things go deep, addressing those issues. Yeah, absolutely.
I did see the exhibit last summer. I want to thank you for it. It was very, very interesting.
Good.
Faith, I think there was a collective gasp when you said that about the yarn.
Oh, yeah, it's startling once you see it.
Mm-hmm. But, I read that she didn't go down south. Now, maybe that's wrong.
I don't know if she came this far down, but she wanted to emphasize that she traveled around the East Coast.
Okay, I'm going to point that out to Portia and Kimberly. They'll find that interesting.
It was Crystal Fleming, I think, who said it. They'll know her name.
Okay.
Carol, I have a question here in our Oak Room.
Mhm.
It's not really a question. I just wanted to comment. I think this is a magnificent collection of photographs. And some of us know portions of this history, but it makes it so much more real and present to have these images to connect with the stories. I hope tons of people get to see this.
We've had, I have to tell you, it has been so satisfying when I walk through the galleries anytime during the day, and I like to do that often, is that it's the only gallery with a lot of people in it. And I think it's got word of mouth. I think people have gravitated towards photographs too, and it also just packs a punch. I've never seen so many people photograph the text panels, which most people don't like to read when they go to a museum. And I totally understand that. They want the visual satisfaction, but I've seen people photographing the text panels. So that gives us a lot of satisfaction.
Any other questions or comments?
I just want to thank Carol for giving this incredible talk. And I think for a lot of us, I mean, it really stimulated us to learn more about the topics. And I mean, I've done a number of reading about Black history, but I really think that it makes me want to learn more, because obviously I need to dig deeper into it. So thanks. And the images, of course, made it so vivid too.
Mm-hmm. So can I tell you is that we're going to have Portia give a talk on February 6th. And I think for now, it's still going to be in person, but then also on Zoom. But I can confirm that for you. And then on January 23rd, which is just a couple of weeks from now, is Dr. Paul Ortiz, who some of you probably know, who's the head of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. He wrote a book called Emancipation Betrayed, all about Florida and Black history in Florida. And he's going to give a talk currently now, both in person and hopefully on Zoom. So we'll keep you abreast of all of that.
Yeah, if you wind up getting Zoom links, if you'll share them with us, that would be wonderful. I'll share them with the group.
Great.
Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful way to start the day. And we sure appreciate everyone being with us. Stay well and Happy New Year.
Thank you.
And thank